Hi everyone, my name is Mona and I'm here to talk to you guys today about generic drugs versus brand name drugs. So I work in a pharmacy in Atlanta, Georgia, and often we get patients that are financially unable to afford their medications that are written by their physicians. We often substitute generic alternatives which can cut the cost into a fraction compared to the brand name version. Although there are some differences in the manufacturing, quality, and effectiveness of the generic medications, it is often recommended to fill the generic in order for the patients to be able to consistently afford their prescriptions month by month. I want to explain the differences and similarities in generic and brand name drugs in order to raise awareness for people to save on their medical necessities. So first I want to talk about what generic drugs are. Generic drugs are drugs that have the same dosage, active ingredient, and uses the same brand name drug as the generic. So the generic for Zyrtec is cetirizine. The generic for Flonase is fluticasone, just to give you a couple examples. Generic medications go through the same FDA approval in order to ensure that they are safe to use, as just like the brand name medicine. Some FDA requirements include the strength of the medicine and how it is administered has to be equivalent to the brand name counterpart. Now that we know what generic drugs are, we can start talking about the similarities and differences in brand name versus generic. So some similarities: generic medicine must follow the same production standards as brand name medicine. Another similarity between brand and generic medicine is that they both have the same ability to enter the bloodstream at the same amount of time, and effects of the medicine should remain active for just as long according to the FDA regulations. Also, generic medications have the same amount of shelf life as brand name medications, so the active ingredient will expire around the same time. Some differences in brand versus generic. Though generic medications have a lot of similarities to brand name medications, there are some differences that need to be noted. Generic medications may differ in size, color, shape, packaging, and sometimes flavor. Some generic medications are not therapeutically equivalent to brand name. For example, Synthroid is not equivalent to the generic of levothyroxine because they have a different active ingredient, which they're a thyroid medication, which is worth monitoring for some patients because it can take a toll on their thyroid health. There is also a difference between EpiPen and generic epinephrine because the administration is different. The generic epinephrine injector must be injected for 10 seconds, while the EpiPen only needs to be injected for 3 seconds, and that's according to a CBS article. There are times when generic is actually not available. When a prescription is written, there's a DAW code on it, which means dispense as written, and sometimes physicians prefer the brand name in order for the patient's better effect on their health. Also, many patients sometimes prefer, because insurance may cover the brand name medicine in some instances, which it can save them money. So I think the biggest factor that influences patients to get generic medicine is that the cost is significantly cheaper. Many health insurance companies learned the similarities of generic medicine and branded, so they only covered the generic so they don't have to pay more money to cover their patients. Many generic medications cost about 80 to 85% compared to the brand name medicine, according to a VCA Hospital corporate article. Now we can talk about some of the pros and cons of generic versus brand name. So there are many pros to generic drugs, such as they're cost effective, they're FDA approved, and they meet the same standards as a branded medication. The negatives of generic drugs are that sometimes they taste differently than the branded medications, and the patients cannot prefer that sometimes if they're children. The purpose of generic drugs is to make medications more affordable. In order to do that, many of the pills are produced in China and India, which can in some instances cause contamination due to the pollution in the country. Now let's decide what drives your choice. Many factors influence your choice in picking brand versus generic, but many times patients defer their judgment to their physician. Many physicians still believe the branded medications work better, but some patients simply cannot afford these medications, so they have to opt for a generic. So in conclusion, I hope the general facts that I have provided give the audience a better understanding of the differences of generic versus brand name. The information can provide patients to make the right decisions when it comes to receiving their medications, and it can also save them money. It is imperative for people to distinguish when is it appropriate to receive brand versus generic so they can live their healthiest lives. Thank you, everyone.